Today we're going to talk about something called interval notation. It involves inequalities, and we're going to do just the basics of interval notation and a quick review of how to graph inequalities. We're not going to solve any today, we're just going to be graphing. So one thing we need to remember, if you have a less than or greater than symbol, on a graph it has an open circle. Okay, if you have an equal sign with it, so less than or equal to or greater than or equal to, then on a graph it's going to have a closed circle. Now what we're going to add in today is this idea of what's called interval notation. Okay, if you have an open circle, then you're going to use parentheses. One way to think about it is if you have an open circle, you kind of put parentheses together to make it a circle, an open circle. Okay, then if you have closed circle, then your interval notation is going to be made of brackets. Okay, and those are more like straight line brackets, whereas your parentheses are curved. Okay, so first thing, let's just do the graphing part before we add interval notation in. So my graph here says x is greater than 3. Okay, now because it does not have an equal sign with it, that means I need an open circle at 3. So there's my open circle at 3, and I need numbers that are greater than 3, which means I need to shade to the right. The one below that says x is greater than or equal to 3. Okay, so because I have the equal sign, remember that means that I'm going to be putting a solid point at 3, and then again greater is going to the right. Okay, so make sure you have those examples down on your paper there. Let's look at the less thans. So with our less thans, we have x is less than -2. So because it doesn't have the equal sign, I need an open circle at -2. There's my open circle at -2, and I want numbers that are less than -2, which means I'm going to be shading to the left. So an open circle at 2 and shade to the left. The bottom one says x is less than or equal to -2. So at -2, I need a closed circle. Okay, and again, I want the numbers that are less than -2, which means I need to shade to the left again. Those numbers are smaller or less than -2. Okay, so that's just the inequality. Okay, so this first part here is called the inequality. This is the graph. Okay, and now we're going to bring in something called interval notation. So when I look at a graph, I can see, first of all, this first one on the left, I can see this happens at 4, right? I know that it's just going to be a less than or a greater than because I have the open circle. Because I have that open circle, it's going to be just a less than or just a greater than. Now, it's going to start at 4, but then the numbers 5, 6, 7, those are highlighted. So those are numbers that are greater than 4. So my inequality is going to be x is greater than 4. Now, when we do interval notation, it basically gives us our boundaries, where it starts and stops. Okay, so in my graph, keep in mind we read graphs from left to right. Okay, so I read starting at the left and going to the right. So my graph, in our case, starts at 4, but then it goes to the right forever and ever and ever. Well, down at the right, keep going down, we actually have something called infinity. Okay, it looks like a sideways 8. So this is where my interval notation is going to come from. Okay, it involves the number 4, and then put a comma, and then 8, the infinity, 4 and infinity. Now 4, because there's an open circle at 4, I put a parenthesis with the 4. Remember back at that table where we said if you have an open circle, then you were going to use parentheses? Okay, so at 4, I have a parentheses. Now, infinity, whenever you have infinity, you always use parentheses. Okay, because it keeps going on forever and ever, and you can't include infinity. So that's why it's not, it doesn't have a bracket. So this is called interval notation. If I look at the next one, okay, again, I'm reading my graph left to right. I see a 5 here. Okay, on the left side, this is called negative infinity because it's going forever and ever into the negative direction. Okay, so I see my 5 has a closed circle. That means it's going to have an equal sign, right? The numbers that are shaded are 4, 3, 2, 1. Those are numbers that are less than. So my inequality is going to be x is less than or equal to 5. Okay, and then I'm going to write my interval notation. It goes, again, left to right. Okay, so we're reading it left to right. So on the left side, I'm going to have my negative infinity. On the right side, I'm going to have a 5. Now, because the point is darkened, remember that means it includes 5. So that's where I want my bracket, because it includes 5. On the left side here, I have infinity. Remember, infinity, I can't ever include infinity because it keeps going forever and ever. So that's going to have a parenthesis. So this is our interval notation. I have a parenthesis, a negative infinity, comma, 5, and then I have a bracket because it includes 5. Okay, so for this one here, I'm giving you a graph. I want you to write both the inequality and the interval notation. Okay, so we are at -1. This number is at -1. It's an open circle, and I have numbers that are greater than that. So x is greater than. I don't need the equal to because it's an open circle. So it's greater than -1. So thinking about what's happening here, this is -1. This would be positive infinity. So when I write my interval notation, it's going from -1 to positive infinity. Because it's an open circle, I have a parenthesis, and infinity, I always have a parenthesis. On the second one, this is about, looks like 6.5 to me. That's 6.5. The numbers that are being shaded is less than. Okay, so x is less than, and it's going to have an equal because that is a solid point. Less than or equal to about 6.5, it looks like. Okay, so again, looking at our figure, reading left to right, I have negative infinity on the left side, 6.5 on the right. So when I write my interval notation, it goes from negative infinity to 6.5. So now I just think about parentheses and brackets. I know infinity always has a parenthesis. The 6.5 has a closed point, so I need to include it. That means I'm going to have a bracket. Okay, so now you've had several examples. First thing we're going to do is we're just going to practice identifying the right inequality, the right interval notation, that sort of thing. So you're going to get a second piece of paper here that has 10 interval notation type questions. Okay, they're multiple choice. You can go through and circle them on your paper first. What you're going to do is you're going to go into Google Classroom. I have an assignment posted. Okay, it's a Google form. So it's going to ask you what's the answer to number 1. So after you type in your answer to number 1, if it's correct, it'll go to question number 2. If you're wrong, it's going to stay on question 1. So you're going to have to watch very carefully to make sure you're paying attention to what number you're on. Okay, after you do that, there is a worksheet that you need to complete. Okay, and again, it's just practicing with interval notation and graphing inequalities.